good afternoon. My name is Filippo Lancieri. I'm a postdoc here at the Zurich Center for Law and Economics, and I have the pleasure of moderating this final session, which is Building Bridges in AI Policy 2. We had a session in the morning, and now we're going to conclude with a secondary session. We have a terrific panel. Each panelist is going to start some short opening remarks. I'll introduce them and then give them the opportunity to talk, and then we'll move to a moderated discussion and Q&A, so please be active, send questions. This is supposed to be an engaging discussion. So starting, we have the honor of receiving Ambassador Roger Dubach, who is the Deputy Director of the Director of International Law at the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. Ambassador Dubach leads much of the Swiss Confederation's work and negotiations in international AI policy. So Ambassador Dubach, so how do you see the international and the Swiss movements on AI regulation? And the floor is yours for the beginning, please. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon in the final session. So I will talk about the regulatory landscape and what it means to build bridges in the regulatory landscape. We have produced a report on artificial intelligence and international rules, which has been adopted by our government this spring. And so my remarks are based on this report. And before talking about bridges, we should talk about the gaps. And so when we have been analyzing the regulatory landscape, we realized that there are different layers of regulation. And we have identified 5, and I will quickly introduce those five layers. So traditionally, international law is legally binding instruments. This still exists. I mean, there is work ongoing on the UN level, Council of Europe, and so on. That's the first classical level, but I would say it's not the most important when it comes to IA. The second level is soft law instruments. There's a lot of discussion about it. You think of instruments from OECD, the UNESCO, and so on. The third one are enactments by governments with de facto international significance. So typically you think about the US, the EU, or China, where the legislation goes beyond its own territory. Then the fourth level is self-binding ethical principles and technical standards. So on the one hand, you have associations or companies which set their own principles when it comes to AI. And then you have the standardization work, especially from the international standardization organizations, also dealing with artificial intelligence. Then finally, and that's perhaps a special one, we call it the normative power of the factual, which means that big companies are de facto regulating, because if they introduce new technology, it has an impact and can have a direct impact on the regulatory level. So one key takeaway from our report was to see that on all those levels there are discussions about principles, especially the ethical principles. And it's very interesting to see whether an international lawyer or somebody from a standardization organization means the same when talking about transparency or discrimination. And they don't, it's not the same. And so I think there is the bridge building starting. And from there, as the Swiss government, we have now different approaches or actions where we try to build bridges. And so I would like to mention 3 fields of action. The first one is, it goes without saying, but it's establishing links or establishing an interplay between those 5 levels. And so it starts by talking to each other. And I would say there's also an idea behind not to over-regulate, because there's a lot of discussion, should we regulate or not? In fact, all levels are doing work and are regulating. And so I think an important task would be to not to have a chaotic regulation in the end, but that it's somehow it goes together in the end. And the second part is also that, and it was said in the previous panel, that we should start with existing rules and see how they apply to IA. It's not because it's IA that everything has to be newly regulated. Secondly, it's building bridges across actors and disciplines. And I think that's very important, that legal experts and technical experts are talking to each other to develop a common vocabulary and common definitions and so on. And then thirdly, and this is my last remark, as the title of this panel, you need also to build bridges across regions. And I think it's very important that we are here this afternoon. And of course, if you are in any international multilateral forum, there is a kind of a cross-cultural approach, but sometimes there is not enough discussion around the cultural approaches to IA. And I hope that we'll have this discussion this afternoon. So thanks very much.
Thank you, for sure. And I think in this idea of building bridges across regions, we have actually joining us online Zeeshan Qamer, who is a member of the Indian Administrative Service and has worked as a director of industries, director of mines, director of sports, and presently posted as deputy commissioner of Godda, a district in the Jharkhand state in India. So Zeeshan, how is India going about the creation of AI policies, and what are constraints in adopting AI in a diverse country like India? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me on this panel. Once again, greetings to all from India. Presently, I'm posted as a deputy commissioner. We have a mandate of looking, delivering service delivery in the district called Godda. So on this building bridges in AI policy, we all know that the economic potential of using artificial intelligence is tremendous. In 2018, the think tank of Indian government, Niti Aayog, recognized the potential of AI in solving the social challenges faced by citizens in areas such as health, agriculture, education, and all. Over a period of time, AI has seen significant growth in India. I would say that its robust startup ecosystem with AI-powered innovation has the highest AI skill penetration rate in India. Nowadays, it is becoming an essential tool in delivering efficient and transparent service delivery. But it is also a fact that till now in India, it has grown through enthusiastic state governments. There are state governments which are enthusiastic about adopting new technologies. It is up to them to, they start something new in AI. There are some research organizations, there are some private sectors which are adopting this system, but it is yet to take or become essential element and ingredient of policy making in India. We are talking about building bridges in AI policy. So before coming to that point, I would say that we have seen different AI ethics, principles, which is working all over the world. But we realize in India that it should be any AI principle. It should be grounded in the fundamental rights as accorded by the Indian Constitution to its citizens. Any policy in implementing artificial intelligence must find a balance between innovation and governance. For building bridges in AI policy, which is the topic of the day, we should work upon scaling of workforce. Some things are required very much before we come to building bridges, like facilitation for adoption of AI, promotion of research, and most importantly, the evolution of guidelines in conformation with regulatory and legal framework here in India. If I understood it clearly, the topic building bridges in AI policy, that we are talking about how we will go ahead, that it is included in our policy making. Here in India, we make policy. Since India is a very diverse country, we have more than 1,000 speaking languages which are being spoken in different parts of the country. We have different people of all color, people of all culture, different cultures. So here in India, like it's not like that one solution fits all condition. We have different landscape, different. There is so much of diversity in India that before building this bridge, we'll have to consider many things. And we all know that if you adopt any new technology, then it demands trust in functioning. And more than trust comes from explainability. What are you going to give? What if something is going in? What is coming out? You have to explain this to people, and we have to keep also in mind the balance between protecting our society and without stifling the research and innovation. So again, I'm coming back to the paper, research paper published by Niti Aayog, the think tank in India, that we can curb these problems, the problem of introduction of artificial intelligence in policy making. We have to consider, we can broadly group these problems into two groups. That is, first is systemic. Here in India, I mean, due to some conditions prevailing, we have not much understanding in general level and in the population level, which makes it very difficult to adopt. There are challenges in explainability also, and when it is difficult to explain outcomes, then it becomes to generate trust among the stakeholders, among the users. And there are risk of accountability, risk of privacy, and security risks are also there. In India, we have more than 130 billion people. So we have to give them jobs also. So one aspect everywhere in India is to when greater automation or greater AI, I mean, it will reduce, it will be hard hitting on the jobs. So it has a societal impact also. Uh, we all know, I mean, what I understood about artificial intelligence is like making machines intelligent. I mean, it makes decision as a human being by employing techniques and feeding data. Machines learn from experiences and keep adapting to new situations. And so consistency in the outcome becomes one of the key features in artificial intelligence. We have to take into mind all these before building all these bridges, which makes, I mean, the policy making and whatever is there, like introducing AI into policy making. There are ethical considerations which demands that in India we have some ethical consideration. Again, I would say that we are a diverse country, so it becomes very important for us that it does not discriminate between people of different colors, different language, different religions, different cultures. So before building bridges in AI, I mean, for policy making, we must accommodate these systemic considerations. And these are like, if I may outline some of them, then it is safe and reliable deployment. By safe and reliable deployment, I would say that we should take care of spurious correlation. I was going through some articles, so it was that some problem was created when there was a spurious correlation between, I mean, same input was not giving the same output. So we should be mindful of that. And it should be explainability is another consideration, consistency, incorrect decision making, and privacy risk. These are important aspects before we go ahead in this. And one most important thing is regulatory and legal framework. We all know that currently in India, we don't have any overarching guidance framework for the use of AI system. So establishing such a framework would be crucial for providing guidance to all the stakeholders. I mean, different stakeholders of AI ecosystem shape the future, and it is essential to have a common set of principles, which the previous speaker was also saying about this. Again, it must be grounded in the accepted value of the national standard. And we must develop common set of principles, must accommodate the constitutional provisions of right to equality, right against discrimination, right to life, and right to privacy. So we must consider principle of safety, principle of equality, principle of inclusivity, principle of privacy. If I may say, I mean, these few principles. One more thing is that while identifying the principle, I mean, is a very essential starting point. And another thing is operationalizing it is the next important step. if AI to adhere to the principle, it is a multidisciplinary approach. So government's role as a policy maker, makes it a very important stakeholders. We have some judgments in Supreme Court of India also, which says that technology should be adopted, technology should be part of policy making, but it should always uphold the fundamental rights of citizen, and it should also improve efficiency. So we can, we can be thankful to the. We should be ready for adopting these technologies. There are some areas where government might intervene, that is regulatory intervention, legal framework, and policy intervention, and most importantly, making this diverse population aware and making capacity building for that. So I will end my remark on this, that we'll have to go very, in a very calibrated way in the so that providing a service delivery efficiency and transparency, but at the same time, it upholds the right of privacy, right of equality, right of, inclusivity and all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think your talk really shows how there's a conflict between global values and specific country-specific dynamics. And I think building on this, I want to go to Golestan or Sally Radwan, who is a PhD candidate at the Royal Holloway University of London, who is working on AI explainability requirements in healthcare, a fellow at the American University in Cairo, and an expert of various international organizations. And until a few months ago, actually, Golestan she would lead the national strategy for Egypt and the Arab and African Task Force to unify AI efforts in both regions. So, Sally, how do you see the developing countries in general and the African and Arab regions in particular participating and shaping these global conversations on AI regulation? Thank you.
Thank you, Filippo, and great to be here. Thank you very much to Aisha and ETH for the organization and for inviting me. I think I'll borrow Ambassador Dubach's opening in that in order to identify bridges, we first must identify the gaps. And I'm very thankful that he laid out these 5 levels of regulatory interventions, because it then becomes very easy to compare developing countries, and with a particular focus maybe on Egypt, Africa, the Arab world, and more developed countries. I've been fortunate enough to kind of have a leg in both worlds, so to speak. So while focusing on Egypt, Africa, and the Arab world, I also worked in many international organizations, drafting many of these ethical instruments and policy recommendations. And at the same time, I also, through my academic work, crossed the divide between the technical side and more the ethical and policy side. And what I see in both is that there actually is a rift that needs to be closed somehow. Otherwise, we're risking quite a bit of divergence, I would say. If I start by maybe giving an example of the priorities that were identified when we first started developing a national AI strategy for Egypt, and then following on from that, when we started consolidating requirements of African countries within the African Union Task Force. So the first priorities were, first of all, AI was and is still viewed as a huge opportunity and a little bit of a risk. And I feel like in the developed countries, it's a little bit the other way around. It's a bit like, whoa, how do we stop this thing? With the possible exception of the US, which is more, how do we make money out of this thing? But in developing countries, it's really more about the social and economic upsides that can be gained out of AI. How can AI help us leapfrog the innovation gap that developing countries are suffering from? How can it help us accelerate certain economic sectors? How can it help us close the digital divide? And also, how do we protect ourselves against the risk of specifically multinational corporations just rolling out their products in our regions without us having any say about it and without us having any contribution, whether it's through data sets, through audit or through any certification mechanisms? And how do we ensure that this technology doesn't violate our values, our principles, our traditions, and of course our laws? So I think this is where things start diverging a little bit, because it's very difficult to bring the ethics first or regulation first discussion to a developing country that has very different priorities. And to do that, we must always link it to the upside from AI, to the economic benefit from AI, to very specific and tangible things, rather than having a general conversation. And I think the same applies to the divide between kind of the technical community and the regulation or policy community, where I'm starting to see an increasing amount of almost cynicism from the technical community going, of ethics, they'll always talk about ethics, and they're trying to impose all these restrictions on us, and we're just trying to do something great. So let us just give us the chance to do it first, and then let's talk about ethics. And I think there is definitely a gap there that I don't think can be closed by tight regulation. I think it needs to be closed by dialogue and by education and awareness and by interdisciplinarity of work, rather than imposing harsh measures. I'll stop here. There's a lot, I think, to unpack in that, but just as a starting point, and then we can talk about what do we do about it.
Yes, thank you. We'll definitely get back to this topic in the discussion, but now I think you can hear from the technical community.
Thank you. The decisions are made by those who show up. When I speak to engineers and scientists about how the importance of engineers and scientists engaging with local policy making, I always start with this phrase. But I think when we start to talk about AI policy making, it takes on a different type of urgency. And it's because this is a very rapidly evolving technology that's permeating our world, our society in many different ways. And, in particular, I think the advent of deep learning, multi-layer neural networks, which really bring a different way of analyzing data with computers. And so when we think about policy making in this context, I think we need to be very intentional about who's sitting at the decision-making table and make sure we're actively seeking to engage all of the stakeholders and seek out those who are stakeholders but might not be at the table, kind of to the point you just made, Sally. So on the one hand, you might say, well, new technologies always require new policies, and eventually we figure this out as a society. And so, why should we think about AI differently, or maybe should we think about AI differently? Can we latch on to patterns of policy making that might have worked in other contexts? So I will say deep learning in particular has some unique aspects to it. One, it's evolving very rapidly. When I finished my PhD, data science wasn't even a term in existence. And people thought Python coding was cute for people who didn't really know how to code. A few years later, it became one of the most in-demand skills, probably in the tech sector. At the same time, I've already mentioned this, deep learning has permeated society very quickly. I think it's very rare for a new technology to be so integrated into society. You are affected by deep learning probably every day in many ways that you are not aware of. And that being said, there's many fundamental gaps in our understanding of how this technology works. We don't know why a particular AI model says that's a cat, yet we trust that it does say that's a cat most of the time. We trust the output that you get from Google, for example. And then that kind of leads into another question, which is that a lot of the advancement in AI right now is being driven by private sector. And while that's probably the most true in the US where I come from, I think that what you'll see in sort of the most cutting edge research papers, that's true with maybe one notable exception of China, across the world in terms of sort of where the academic kind of forefront is right now. And so that means that you're maybe missing out on some obvious governance hooks that might come if it was more public sector funded. And at the same time that maybe there's a handful of large tech companies that are really driving advancement in AI, they're making the outputs, the tools, the models available to just about anyone. I can build an application knowing very little about deep learning, but I can build a computer vision application that, identifies people's faces, for example. And And so all of that kind of leads to, there are a lot of benefits and a lot of harms of AI, and many of them are indirect. And so they're not really well known. And that makes it sort of different to maybe another technology that quite transformative, that is continuously reshaping, say, our geopolitical landscape even today, which is nuclear technology, a little less than a century old. We're still learning how to regulate and how to develop policy around nuclear technology, but there's massive differences in kind. That technology was developed primarily through governments, with a lot of sort of oversight of how the technology would be used, how it might be controlled, baked into the development of the technologies. Even today, using and developing nuclear technology requires pretty advanced skills. And finally, some of the most critical inputs to using nuclear technologies, things like fissile materials, they're limited in the world, and also they're traceable. So that's a very different kind of landscape around a technology that we're still really trying to grapple with from a policy perspective and an international policy perspective. And so I think because of these differences, it's imperative that we have technologists engage and be engaged in policy discussions. One reason is that the technologists really are the ones that have the most understanding of what AI can do, what it's capable of, both good and bad. It's good for the technologists to be engaged in these discussions because they really need to understand, we all need to understand, what is the ethical. And I think that, when it comes to building bridges, this is where we have to be very patient because we use different words, we have different incentive structures, we have different reasons for wanting to sit at the table. And so to really build policy and bridge the gap between all the different areas of expertise, be that policy, be that economics, be that AI technology, you have to put in the time to understand each other, overcome maybe potential barriers in jargon, barriers in values, to really build that bridge between these communities. And so with that, I'll there's a lot more to discuss here, but I'll sort of wrap up there and just as a reminder say, let's make sure everyone who's a stakeholder, which is really everyone in AI policy, shows up to the table when we make decisions.
Thank you. And I think you're so eager to participate. I couldn't even introduce you yet.
Yes.
To say that you are I think I've mentioned that you're the AI chief strategist for HP Enterprise and also the founder of an NGO that actually tries to engage people in STEM in their local governments and communities. And you actually hold a PhD in physics. That's nice. And I think we heard a lot from actually in the morning, a little bit from also bottom-up approaches and having different views of the community. So we have a great final speaker here, Rahel Estermann, who is the Deputy Secretary General and Head of Policy for the Green Party of Switzerland, and has a specific focus on digital issues. And she grew up on a farm in Lucerne and knows that there's a real digital divide. And you also have a PhD in sociology. So I wanted to ask you that you studied a lot on digital data in journalism, but at the same time, as you mentioned, you grew up in a farm in Lucerne. So how do people there perceive technology, and how can this filter into actual policymaking, like bringing these views from the bottom down?
Thank you, Filippo. Thank you for the invitation to you and also to Aisha for being here. Yes, you've heard many aspects of my my life, but today here I'm talking about from the heart of politics, where I work of Swiss politics, and I have also I'm a member of the Parliament of Lucerne, so that's a very low-level politics. I'll say, let's say a local level of politics, not low-level of politics. So I borrow from there, from my experiences there, and yeah, I think it's a very interesting question to think about building bridges from this perspective. Maybe there are other gaps I see than you, or maybe those are the same gaps. It was quite refreshing to hear lots of my aspects as well from India, but we will come to that later. First of all, yes, my background in rural Lucerne. My mother is still living on a farm, but she also has a smartphone. I mean, that's the reality today. We have smartphones everywhere. We have the technology who's in smartphones, including AI everywhere. So this is not a gap we see there, but we see a gap in the approaches, I think. We see people who do not understand what happens on their smartphones, right? they don't understand how AI works in apps or whatever you have on your smartphones, and I think that makes them a bit scary. And they don't know how to turn off certain functions. Why is my iPhone telling me you should watch less your display or stuff like that? And for me, there is the point where we need to start building bridges, because especially in our Swiss democracy, where we can decide a lot, but I think that also is the case in other countries. We need to like have a population which is kind of conscious about what happens, which knows a bit what happens, which is understands technology, not in a detail. I mean, not everyone needs to know how deep learning works, but a little bit what does happen here around me? What does technology do with me? And people must be able to operate it. They must be able to, how do I turn off this app on my iPhone? To tell it like very simple. And we need, with those like approaches, we need to like take everyone on the journey we go on, this policy journey, on this journey as a society. And there was one like experience I made like 1 month ago in our parliament in Lucerne, which is very on a local level. We debated a digital strategy for our region, and it was very interesting that there was one topic which united every party in our parliament, and that was like, we need to take everyone on our journey. We need to be transparent, and we need to give competences and educate people to work with technology. This was kind of a consensus in our parliament, and this was especially a point mentioned by people from rural regions of Switzerland. They come from a background of farming, of older people, of families. I mean, all those people that are not used to work with technology every day. And this is, I think, a very important basics for our politics. Before we even start to talk about innovation policy or visions where we want to go with AI, we should not forget that this is very important. And I mentioned already Swiss democracy. We voted on a digital issue like 1.5 years ago. People rejected the project of electronic identity. And that was, I think, not because people were scary, but because they got savvy in judging about what kind of technology do we want. So it is important that people understand that, and that we can take them on a journey. So before I think this is also very important basic, that we can see the opportunities and benefits of AI. Because if we make policy with fear in our eyes, or with fear about not understanding and not being able to control what's going to happen afterwards, that's not that we won't be able to see those opportunities. So for me, this is kind of the baseline we need to fix in our politics, and to really be able to bridge those digital divides. Maybe we have them, maybe we are able to bridge them, but I think those is a very important issue in politics before we even start to have our great visions of AI.
Thank you. That's a very interesting view. So I'll come for questions for everyone, I think, building on your remarks. So I think being in academia is a belief in the scientific method, which means you only believe in an idea after you probed it and you try to cancel it, let's put it like this. So I'm going to do my best to be a contrarian here and push on what exactly convergence means. And I'll start by saying that I come from the antitrust world, where convergence is a bit of a notion of harmony. Of building bridges means we have to have a single policy around the world. And for decades, we spent billions of dollars doing trainings, having organizations. There's the OECD, the ICN, the UNCTAD. And then what happens is that digital revolution came and everybody's doing their own thing. And every time everybody wants to converge to their own national standard. And if you don't converge, then it's all about sovereignty, I don't know, industrial policy, autonomy, and things like this. So do we really believe that convergence with AI is necessary, or is this like wishful thinking? Like, let's be honest about it. That everybody is speaking here about the Indian questions about privacy, local Lucerne voting on, or like Switzerland voting on a specific topic. So I guess I wanted to start asking, I think, Ambassador Dubach and Sally, because you have more of this global view, but then hearing from the other ones. So is convergence optimal? And what is the level of convergence? Is it like global, regional, bilateral? So how do you see this discussion? I'll start with you on this.
Thank you very much. That's a tough question. And the answer, of course, is you need all of that. But perhaps first, I think it's a very valid point, because I agree with you that it's very easy to say everybody has to sit at the table and we have to talk to everybody. We had the first experience last spring where we organized with the standardization organization a conference. It was about legislation, impact assessment, and standardization. And it's very difficult to have such a discussion. Okay, you can say now that's very technical, but I mean, in the end, they have to understand each other. And what I see is that everybody says, yeah, I'm open, I'm ready to talk to everybody, but they have to come to me. And for instance, I try to better understand that the standardization discussion, it's very difficult. I think I'm not able to understand it. And as you said, there are so many specific terms. It starts with, in the IEC, the committee is GEC 42. I mean, then it goes on, So I think it's very tough to have everybody on the table understanding each other. So that's a big obstacle for conversions. And as you said, also it needs passions yeah. And then another difficulty is where is the starting point? And Sally was talking about that. And I think, as you said, if the starting point is how to leapfrog, it's completely a different way for entering the discussion than if you say, okay, we are a developed country, we have another approach. And there, what I see is, and that would be my recommendation, I think you should start with the conversions on quite a technical level. That's why we engaged with the standardization community, because somehow if you go, it becomes more and more political, then it's very difficult. And we should not forget that many countries or institutions have a very clear strategic idea when it comes to regulating IA, and then you can forget conversions, to be very clear. So my answer would be that you have to be aware of the obstacles and then to see where you can start with conversions. Saying that, as I outlined the different levels on regulating, I think it makes absolutely no sense that everybody starts regulating by its own. So there is a need for convergence and building bridges, but you have to be realistic.
Sally, so how was the process of bringing the African and Arab nations together to try to?
Fun. First of all, I totally agree. I think, again, it can't start with, let's have common legislation. That will never work. Countries will always be different countries. People will be different. Different regions will have different priorities. There will be agendas. There will be global events that shape the way we see the world. In my opinion, it'll never work. We're just shooting ourselves in the foot if we try to have convergence at that level, as you said. I think the two things, if I were to pick two entry points for convergence, the first would be definitely education, awareness, capacity building, as has been said on this panel and in other panels as well. I don't understand why there isn't enough attention in the world dedicated to that. I don't understand why there aren't more efforts dedicated to educating people at the most basic level. And as you said, not everyone needs to understand how deep learning works. However, everyone needs to understand what it is, what it can do, what it cannot do, what it can do for them, what the risks are, what the benefits are. And not everyone has that understanding, not even in many cases, unfortunately, the people who are legislating it. And so we need to, to go back to the example of Egypt, for example, when we started developing a national AI strategy, we identified capacity building as one of the main pillars. And the way we went about this was to identify what a potential AI ecosystem looks like and what the different roles for people and organizations within that ecosystem would look like. And then you start developing education programs and training programs for each of these audiences or each of these groups, because everyone needs a different level of understanding of AI to be able to perform their role fully. And I think capacity building, actually, compared to many other aspects of technology or AI, is easily scalable, because you won't find the requirements between Egypt and Switzerland when it comes to AI education. Yeah, okay, we might need a little bit more fundamental education than Switzerland, but by and large, it's the same groupings, it's the same requirements, it's the same curricula even that you could share with minor adjustments. So this would be my first wish for convergence. So let's stop trying to converge on legislation or on whatever laws we try to impose. And unfortunately, there are regions and countries and entities that try to impose their own view of the world on everyone else, which will never work. And let's focus on something like education. The other point that I'd love to make is, again, as Ambassador Dubach mentioned, it needs to be a technical entry point. And I think the term I would use is more specific and more granular. We need to become less abstract. We need to become less generic in the way we talk about AI. And I'll give you a couple of quick examples. Everyone talks about explainability and how AI needs to be more explainable. And the EU Act says, every AI system needs to be explainable and needs to be transparent. I don't know that everyone who's reading that document has the same understanding of what explainability actually means.
But they have a definition section in the beginning. No.
But it's, believe me, like we were having that discussion at the OECD a couple of weeks ago, and everyone was saying there is no definition of what explainability means. Part of my research talks about, so when we talk about AI systems in healthcare, for example, needing to be explainable, what does that actually mean? So I went and asked a large number of people, whether it's doctors, patients, or technologists. So what does explainability mean to you when you say, I need a system to be explainable? What does that mean? 0 of these people have said, I need to understand exactly how the algorithm works step by step. It was all about different types of, I need to understand the history of the system. I need to know who developed it. I need to know who signed off on it. I need to know what data it's been trained on. I need to know that it's been able to diagnose cases that are similar to mine. I need to know that it operates within a healthcare system that I trust. But none of them wanted to know every step of the way within a 48-layer hidden neural network. So we need to agree on the definitions. We need to agree that we have the same understanding at a granular level of what AI systems are, because again, AI, as we know, is a big umbrella term. So talking about self-driving cars is very different from talking about a system that will optimize hospital shifts, hospital staff shifts, for example, or again, very different from regulating an autonomous robot that will operate on a patient in real time. Both are in healthcare, but we can't say healthcare by itself, like the EU Act says, healthcare is a high-risk domain. We can't categorize it like that. We have to get a lot more granular and a lot more specific about the use cases and the technologies that we're trying to regulate, and conduct a thorough risk and impact assessment of each of them and make sure that we're all talking about the same thing before we can talk about regulation. So these are the 2 points of convergence that I would see.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I think it goes a bit in the opposite of what we heard before today when we're talking about people from the Council of Europe, how they're trying to shape a 41-country major grand treaty that's going to regulate AI. But we'll get back to you in a second. So I'll enjoy to ask Arti then. So Arti and how do you think about the cost of fragmentation here? Let's flip the question, right? So what is the real cost of fragmentation? And how do you convey this cost of fragmentation? Because a lot of the time what comes from companies is like, oh, regulations are always harmful to innovation unless they're like subsidies, when everybody loves it. It's really good for innovation. Also, how do you go about entering an office of a legislator and telling them like, this is really a problem, we need to start working on this, versus just having a general message?
That's a good but difficult question, because I think there's sort of multiple prongs to it, if you will. So, I mean, I think on the one hand, if you're introducing a product or capability to multiple countries, then the cost of fragmentation can be high if I have to essentially build a product that complies with a lot of different countries' regulations. And so that may, that I think by default means that I'm going to comply with the strictest of the regulations. And essentially that becomes the default policy for all of the countries in which I'm introducing some new technology. But I think this question of standards and vocabularies and definitions becomes very important, because that's not even really possible, I think, right now with AI, given the fact that there's sort of so much variation in what we mean when we say the term AI, what we're talking about. So I sit on an OECD standards committee, and it seems actually the most straightforward of all committees. We are trying to just figure out, how does a country measure domestic compute capacity for AI? It's been over a year, and we've kind of gotten to the point where we can say, what are some of the factors that go into defining what is compute capacity? And that's not even getting into the models and the applications of AI. And so it's a little bit challenging to say, how can we measure the cost of fragmentation right now in a policy perspective? Because we don't even really know what we're regulating right now. We can't agree on that. And so, I think broadly speaking, any technology fragmentation carries costs, but potentially right now there's some benefit to it, because it allows a little bit more room to navigate between sort of different value systems, if you will.
Okay. Anything to add, or do you think that not?
Well, I think the answer cannot be total convergence, neither no convergence. I mean, there are principles we share around the world, and we need to acknowledge that. I mean, technology is something that goes all around the globe. Maybe the same technology, the softwares are the same in certain domains. Social networks go around the world. Companies work in every country, or nearly every country in the world. So I think we cannot say that there's no convergence needed. But on the same time, I mean, the regulation consequences are very specific on the country. They depend on the political and the social context. They depend on the laws and on the lawmakers. I think that's also a very important point that you already mentioned, that what we can expect from lawmaking, maybe parliament, is very different on certain levels. So I think that's really something we need to find our space in between of the extremes of total convergence and no convergence.
Okay, and I think building on this question of what is the strictest regulation, how does it rule or doesn't rule. So sometimes what I think you see potentially in AI, but you see in other areas, is actually the opposite, right? It's a race to the bottom. It's like corporate taxes, everybody's lowering taxes. Cheap subsidies, everybody's giving more and more subsidies, and you have this competition to attract. So do you think that AI is different here? Is there a reason to believe that this fragmentation is not going to mean each country tries to adopt the most business-friendly version of the regulation, which I heard here in Switzerland, like when I have regulation, if I want to be business-friendly, and so I think I'll start by asking this, and then I'll try to probe a bit more. So
starting with me, sure. Okay, so I mean, I think. AI is really interesting. I don't know the answer to even what a race to the bottom might look like with AI, because there are, we talk a lot about potential risks, but there's also risks in not, utilizing AI. So, one area where AI is being used is to sort of expedite drug discovery, identify new compounds. It was, very important, I think, in identifying effective compounds against COVID-19 by leveraging AI to identify sites on the virus, for example, where molecules might bind to it. So that's an example of there's a risk in not having a certain amount of freedom and openness in the use of AI. And so I think it's a little hard to say, are we on a race to the bottom? Because I think that there are lots of potential benefits of AI. And so having a loose regulatory framework isn't de facto harmful. And I think the real question becomes, what are the places where you want to start to implement regulation? And I think it was one of the earlier panels today where, really maybe it's not about the technology, it's about the use of the technology is something to be thought about. Maybe there are a handful of places where the technology has such high potential for risk. You might want to think about regulating the technology itself. There are a lot of regulatory regimes like that in the United States around dual use technologies. But at the same time, I think the application might be a bigger area to sort of consider regulation. And then it's not necessarily about the AI. It might just be about building an application that can discriminate against certain types of students or what have you.
Okay, Zeeshan, can you hear us now? Do you want to try to answer? So when you're trying to shape policy at the regional level, so what are the main considerations? Are you really thinking local, or are you in any way incorporating some kind of like international discussions in your views there? So how do you go about this trade-off?
Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear.
On your question on, convergence, if I may be allowed to be a bit more optimistic, then I would say that, like all other panelists, it is, something to be deliberated upon. Because right now we have few sectoral areas of collaboration between nations, and there are manual collaborations, but I do see that AI will converge on those, but it won't be holistic and blanket one. So many areas, like example, I can give some examples in trade, finance, or maybe in border control. There are possibilities to leverage further on the existing global or regional level of ties or alliances with, we can implement AI. But I think there will be many areas, like in India. In Indian case, I can say that the major thing is like subsidy distribution or military, where probably there will be very limited motivation and need to have any global convergence on core policy level, and hence, there will be it will be very difficult for convergence on these issues.
Thank you. Yes, and I think, Ambassador, then turning to you. So when you think about this kind of shaping of policy, and for example, like Switzerland saying wants to be more business friendly than other places, how do you measure? Is this relative to other places? Just need to be more business friendly than the EU, or is this in absolute levels? Like you want to have a high level of business friendliness, and how do you do this trade off here? So how are you thinking? I'd love to hear from all of the three of you actually this question on how do we going to shape this business friendliness versus more interventionist regulation. Sorry.
Thank you very much. First of all, I like very much that you ask the tough questions to Arti first, so I have time to think about my intervention. So, I want to do 2 points first. The one is that I think there's also not the right idea about which country regulates how much. Just there is one paper on AI regulation, and surprise, the US is the country which has the most AI regulation. So it doesn't mean business friendly. It doesn't mean no regulation. And I think that's important to bear in mind. And then the second point is what I hear from business, but you may correct me, is that the most important point to be business friendly is legal security, to have a kind of a clear criteria to plan and to act. And in 5 years, it will be the same, because that's the worst. If you start investing in a technology and suddenly 2 years later, the whole regulatory framework is different. And so it's not that much about a lot to regulate a lot or not a lot. It's much more what are you going to regulate? And I think, for instance, if you said it before, if you want to invest a lot in the development of AI, you need a legal basis for it. That's a regulation. It can be very business friendly because companies will benefit from it. If you want to invest in education of the people, in technology, skills for technology, you need a legal basis as well. So and so I think if as everybody is talking about regulated against not regulating, I think the most discussion is about when it comes to AI, how to protect people and institutions from misuse and harm. And I think that's the whole discussion. And there I tend to think that on some levels, the approach that you should have no risk at all and you have to put in place all principles, then in the end, it's very difficult to do anything. Because whatever you do, you have also always a risk. And so I think there is the difficult discussion where you have to find a balance. And I mean, that's a personal remark. I regret sometimes that there is no more reflection about whether this risk and principled approach is really the best one. At least in Europe, it seems to be the standard now, and all the discussions are taken up from there. And so, yeah, I stop here.
Yeah, let me ask you this, then I'll get to both of you as well as a question. But when you talk about AI regulation, like the AI Act and things like this, the first thing that people say is that this is a risk-based approach. You know, that's the main word. It's like we're trying to regulate high-risk users with more regulation, low-risk users with low regulation. So is this similar to what you're talking about, or are you talking about something different? Because the notion of this risk-based approach is already, by definition, an interventionist notion that defines what are acceptable versus non-acceptable risk. That's what I'm trying to understand. And then I'd love to hear from you, because we start talking, then I'll go around and ask. So how would you see this?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's the combination of risk and principle-based approach, because the principles are very generic, as Sally said, and both. I would talk about both. Then, when it comes to risk, I think Sally pointed it out very, very well. You have to be specific, and that's the problem. If you have a whole sector and you just say the whole sector is high risk, that's not granular. So I wouldn't say that I'm against the risk-based approach, but I completely agree with Sally. It has to be very, very granular. And first also to understand, and then we start again the big discussions, what Arti said. What's the aim of a regulation? And again, I mean, many people say AI is a technology. Do you really want to regulate the technology? Some people think that the AI definition by the proposal of the European Union is very much a software regulation. It's not that much AI specific. And then there are, I think that's the first very difficult question. What do you want to regulate?
Sally, that's the cue to you, I guess. So do you think that this unified AI approach makes sense, or do you really believe we should be discussing specific targeted regulation for healthcare, for, I don't know, facial recognition, for personal assistance? And where do you where do you stop? You know, like AI is everywhere. You're gonna have 200,000 specific regulations. Is almost like not having any regulation at all.
Yeah, exactly. I do think we need to be more specific. I do think I agree with what Rahel said earlier, that we do need a set of common principles that everyone agrees on, but they need to be short, concise, and there needs to be one set. At the moment, there are like 567 sets developed by different organizations, different companies, different countries, and everyone is like, these are the principles. So as a consequence, there are no principles really that we're all abiding by. However, we do need, and I agree with what Arti said regarding regulating the use, not the technology, because you can't really regulate a technology, and AI doesn't live on its own as a separate entity. In many cases, it's part of an AI plus IoT, for example, or AI plus blockchain, or AI plus just regular software. And at the end of the day, it's the application and the use that you're regulating. If we look at in my opinion, one of the most successful kind of regulation and certification mechanisms, the CE mechanism for the European Union for regulating medical devices, it doesn't talk too much about the technology. It talks about what the device does, what degree of intervention or risk it poses, and so on, and how it can impact patients or doctors or the clinical environment at large. And I think we can borrow an idea or two from that notion of what is the impact of an application that includes AI. What are the potential risks? What are the, for example, the groups that stand to be marginalized or disadvantaged by it, and so on and so forth? And then how do we best achieve a regulation that maximizes benefit for all? And in that regard, I also want to go back to something Arti said earlier about AI possibly being more driven by the private sector than governments. And I really think there is an opportunity here. And in that regard, I think developing countries are leading a little bit on that front, because in many cases, governments are at least investing and are more invested in the kind of abstract sense in AI technologies and applications in the form of public-private partnerships, which I think are, from my perspective, possibly the best way to achieve that balance between kind of letting the private sector run with everything and trying to impose as many regulations as possible to ensure no harm, and governments kind of not knowing what to do and when to intervene. And I think I'll give a quick example. An application that we developed in Egypt, for example, for farmers. It was a personal assistant, mobile-based chatbot plus other functions for smallhold farmers that gives them personalized advice on maintaining their crops, maximizing crop yield, where to best sell their products, and then at what price, advice about weather, advice about diagnosing pests and diseases that affect their plants and how to fight them, and so on. And we did this as a public-private partnership. Requirements came from the government, Ministry of IT and the Ministry of Agriculture working together. And then we got a multinational corporation that had a fund dedicated to AI for development projects that we applied for and got. So you have the cutting edge technology coming from the private sector. You have also part of the funding. You have the kind of nation building mandate of governments and the responsibility that comes with that. And you have the clear requirements on the ground that can also be scaled to other countries. And I think that's probably the best way to approach convergence and the role of government within AI applications, or at least one of the best ways that I know of.
Thank you. And if you have any questions, please raise your hands in the chat as well. I'm following the chat. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send. I'll just ask a final question when I come to you, because first Rahel hasn't spoken much. I wanted to ask you, so there's of course a trade-off between a general regulation and a specific one. One of them is about society engagement, right? So it's already hard to get civil society, to get your constituents or anyone to care when you're talking about the AI Act. If you're going to try to make them care about, I don't know, standard C372 in relation to, I don't know, the share of information between machines is going to be much harder. So how do you see this trade-off between the need for a more general approach where society can engage versus a very technical standard that will, of course, minimize risk, be much more targeted, but then the only people you're going to hear from is probably going to be the lobbyists of whatever company is being impacted by that regulation in particular, you know? So how do you think of that?
Yes, I think there are many points here to wrap up from the discussion before, but to answer first your question, politics is a system of we don't debate about the what's true. We debate about what are our values. So for politics, it's much more easier to debate general principles than this very fragmented standards or whatever that means. Of course, we need to do that as well, but for mobilization in politics, for engaging with civil society, we need to talk about values. That's true, and that doesn't. I think that's also a right approach, because we need to think about what kind of values should we, or our technology should serve which values, right? Where we want to go. That's on a very high level answer for you. And I think then when we go to politics or AI policy and all the discussions we had now here before, I think of course we need to be very specific. That's a bit your point. We need to be very fragmented. I'm agree with that. The thing is a bit, if you really want to try to be specific about risks, you need to have a monitoring, right? Because this technology is already it really deeply, how to say, deeply in our society, in our systems, in our everyday life. So it's really a big thing to try to measure the risks for certain technologies if we really want to be very fragmented. So I think I see there a trade-off from bureaucracy and regulation. And then the thing we started the discussion with, how is that for business and how is it for like the government to regulate trade-offs? I think also I agree with the point that legal security is the most important thing. I think I'm not from business side, but that's also what I hear from them. They want to have legal security, and then they are ready to be regulated or want to be regulated. But then you arrive at a certain point where you think, okay, this is the point business says, oh no, we don't want to be regulated. And it's a point where it's about business models. And there, I mean, it's true that we have now a lot of business models which try to extract data, for example, from people, which kind of harmful for things like democracy. And then it's really hard to regulate, because you really need to change business models of big companies, and then you have a lot of lobbies. It's very difficult. You remember maybe the DSA lobby stuff, where we can all have read on the internet on that. So I think there is a point where we confront with the capitalistic logic from a lot of business companies, and then it's going to be hard to regulate. So that's some points from the discussion before, but I think we have a question.
I think I agree with you that like legal security is important until at some point where security becomes interventionist, and then you have like 2,000 lobbies saying, no legal security here. Actually need less specific rules. Please go ahead.
I think in this entire debate, one point is very fundamental point is missing. If you see the historical evolution of international public law, in last 150 years, I think there are many areas where we could able to get some common grounds, like for example, intellectual property rights, copyright, trademark, patent, international sea law, international trade law, money laundering law. I think there are many laws. I can count around like 40 to 50 laws where we people able to get some international standards or some understanding. I don't see that type of serious efforts in technology regulation. I think we have decided at the global level that we don't want any global standards, and we will have our either national standards or regional standards. Like for example, European Commission or the European Council, they are all making their own treaties, their own conventions. The US is also bringing their own rules and regulation. And now more and more developing countries like the India, Brazil, Mexico, and other developing countries, they want to develop their own ecosystem. So in this uncertainty, because when we say over-regulation, it's a situation of over-regulation and uncertainty. Because as a company, when you're operating at the global level, you really don't know like how many laws I need to follow. and what would be the regulatory changes? Because at national level, law can change at any time through the intervention of the parliament or the judiciary. So my point is that why we haven't seen a serious efforts at the international level, international public law level. So that's the first question which I want to ask you, because you started with your discussion that the first level is international public law, and I don't see serious efforts at that level. And second, in the absence of strong international public law, who's paying for this? Not the big companies. Big companies can afford this regulatory uncertainty, and to some extent they are making money out of it. I think they are beneficial because this regulatory uncertainty gives them some advantage. My question is that new startups or the small enterprises, when they want to expand at the global level, are they able to afford this regulatory uncertainty? So I think there are the two questions. First is from you, sir, because you are dealing with the public international law, and the second is from you because you are dealing with the private sector, uh, like the startups and small enterprises.
Start the ambassador, so now you have time
So, yeah, you have to. Yeah, thanks very much for the question. And I mean, I wish that there was more political will to get an international agreement on those aspects. That's for sure. I mean, my reading is that if you take, for instance, WTO, I mean, before talking about AI regulation, we could talk about international data flows, for instance. And it's just impossible to get an agreement. I mean, WTO has not delivered for 20 years. I mean, I would say, but that's then not in the era of AI anymore, that there is a crisis of multilateralism. All the international agreements you mentioned were done 50 years ago, 60 years ago, and so on. So we are in a different world. And apparently in a world where it's very difficult to, I mean, that's the paradox. We are in a globalized world, but global agreements seem to be impossible at this stage. We also see it very much in the area of data governance, where a global approach would be very much needed. It's not there. I think there are different countries fighting for that. There is in some parts of the world political will, but apparently it's not. The convergence is not big enough. So yeah, I mean, hopefully or maybe we will move into this direction at some point. For time being, it seems to be very, very difficult to.
National interest, but why the international organizations are not doing it?
No.
Why IUs are not doing it?
I think that's that. So I just building on that and giving Arti the opportunity. I think that there's also different context in the sense that at least in the 50s, international trade, there was this notion that open trade was a win-win for everyone. I think that now we're really in a world where national interests are trying. There's a lot of competition. I wanted to hear from you. So what do you think? Why isn't the private sector pushing more for this type of harmonization as a player who's all over the globe and who could build these bridges?
Yeah, and I should also start by saying I don't speak for my NGO or my employer. I just speak for myself right now. But so I mean, I think the question was really, is the lack of international sort of standards around regulation harmful to smaller companies? And maybe the larger companies don't are able to navigate kind of a fragmented landscape. I mean, I'm going to punt a little bit and say I work with a lot of startups in the AI space. From within the U.S. and Europe and APAC, and I would say the regulatory issues are probably the least of the challenges for startups to sort of go international. Their challenges are much more logistical. Can I have presence in another country or another region? To the extent that my AI application is kind of highly tuned to the culture where it's being used, is it even applicable in another country? So. And those are the challenges I typically see. And really the biggest challenge I see is just, do they have the capacity to work with a customer in another country? And so, I'm punting a little bit to say, it's not clear to me that there is enough regulation right now around AI that this is really turning into a massive challenge. for startups. Will that happen? It happens with other technologies, probably. But I also think the sort of data standards is a good point. I think data standards and privacy is an easier thing to start to think about having an international conversation around from a practical level. I also think and I used to work in the House Foreign Affairs Committee as a legislative fellow, and I think on the other hand, that type of information that's a really difficult place for, I think, countries to come together and kind of agree upon even what they're collecting and why, because it ends up having so much to do with what they might value, what a government might value from how they want to manage their society domestically. And then also there's lots of implications for national security and whether or not you want to even let someone else know what information you're collecting and why.
I wanted to give Zeeshan actually the opportunity for you to kind of jump in and speak a little bit about your experiences as a regional, someone who's thinking about regional policy, right? Do you see any demands from civil society or for companies in your area for regulation, or is this mostly a top-down approach where the government is thinking about problems and you're trying to incorporate them in policy while at the same time considering local characteristics? So how would you think about this top-down versus bottom-up in what you're doing there?
See, in India, policies take time to be formulated. Many times because the existing power equation because of impact, if policy is so wide and huge that it has to analyze from all perspectives before it is cast in one stone. So we can take the case of Aadhaar in India. First, there were very, reservations about from the people, from the political parties. But when we realized the importance of it and the importance of Aadhaar in India, also acceptance was very large, very wide. So I think if Indian context, I would say that policy has a better chance of being implemented and accepted and adopted if the core framework is conceptualized and first discussed by the experts and then brought discussion with the political stakeholders, with the public, we will have to make them aware. Then it gets, in my point of view, in India, if you're introducing any new policy or any new technology, then it is for its acceptance, you have to it should be widely, people should be made widely aware and they should be trained in that. And then gradually they they adopt those technologies.
Thank you. We have the time for a final question of the summit. I think in Switzerland we call conferences summits, right? So I don't know if anyone has a final. Please.
Thank you. So most of the discussions were usually targeting or trying to limit the application of AI by regulation or policy as well. Yet we heard that there is also a risk in not using AI. And also that there maybe regulation is not necessarily limiting the innovation capabilities. So I wondered, what is your opinion on whether there should also be the other way around? Like, are there applications that we should try to foster more in terms of policy or regulation as well? For example, autonomous driving, when is safe enough for that the autonomous vehicles are actually performing or producing less accidents than human drivers. What is your opinion on that? When should we push the technology rather than trying to limit it?
Yeah, I think there's a great question for final remarks from everyone. So Sally, I'll start with you and I'll move this way. So give Arti more time to think. So what do you think are the regulations that we should be adopting to promote innovation rather than to try to restrict innovation? So where would you want to see more action taking place in the future?
Yeah, I would love to see that. I think there's huge opportunity for that, and maybe, just maybe, like we did in international trade, when we realized that cooperation makes more sense than competition, then we'll actually converge on the regulation and policy side as well. but again, for me, everything starts with the use case. Everything starts with how can this thing benefit us? Because at the end of the day, technology is a tool that is supposed to facilitate our lives. It's not a goal in itself. And it's interesting that you mentioned the specific domain of self-driving cars, because there are efforts going on around standardizing it. The ITU, for example, is making huge strides in setting standards for autonomous vehicles, and again, individual countries are working on individual kind of sets of regulations. But this can be a point of convergence, as can be AI applications in agriculture, in smart cities, making our cities more sustainable, greener, more livable, more easy to navigate. I think if I were to suggest kind of a global vehicle, it wouldn't be the massive amounts of international organizations that we have debating principles all the time. It would be having an international cooperation vehicle on the uses of technology in general, and how can different countries and different cultures and different priorities be brought together for the betterment of humanity. And I think this can be a vehicle where we can realize, again, at the granular level, as we said, what we actually mean when we talk about certain things, what are different expectations and converging or diverging, and then how can we realize benefit of all out of it. So yeah, from my perspective, this would be an excellent thing to have. And again, I don't understand why it doesn't exist.
Here we go to you. What's going to be your next view, the regulation of X sector or not? So I'm joking. So how do you see this conversation?
I'm not able to mention certain technologies because that's not my business. We are here at ETH. There are so many people who know many more technologies, but I think I would agree mostly at Sally's point that I could maybe mention fields that I think that have a lot of potentials to make our lives better or to save our lives in future. If you think about climate change, I think we have a lot of potential in agriculture. Because there are, agriculture is something that is technologically based in old traditions, but I think we can make it better, and we can, for example, the questions of how to spread pesticides, that's an English word, I think, how we spread pesticides, that's something that we could make that much more better if you could really do it with modern technology, and it's not made. We have other stuff of climate change, saving energy, where technology could help us to, and maybe AI could help us to save energy. We have lots of opportunities, I think, and I would really not invest in the technology, but invest in technology in certain fields, like I said, climate change or agriculture, as certain fields.
Thank you. Ambassador, your next international working group, where is it going to be?
Thanks very much. As it's the final word, I just want to also say 2-3 other points. First of all, not to be misunderstood, Switzerland is an open economy, so we very much need an international framework, and we are very much in favor of that, and also, of course, very much engaged. And you already heard that the Council of Europe is preparing a convention. We are involved there, so that's for sure. And in the end, I don't want to lose my job, because I have to be for international conversion. But I think what's unseen is the kind of regulatory competition, and there are different areas where you hear that I want to be the first having a type of AI convention or agreement and so on. And you want to be the first because you want to be the standard setter, and then it has to apply to everybody else. And I think that's a pity. And it would be good to calm down a little bit and to first sit together and understand the problem, and to see how to bring it together. And then perhaps to the question from Manuel, I just want to say that I don't believe that the technology will solve all world problems. It's in the end a technology. And I mean, in the end, if you want to address climate change, you need a sound climate policy. And then technology can play a role in it. But I think from a policy perspective, you shouldn't overload the technologies. Also, in the sense that it becomes a heavy burden. I mean, if a technology has to solve all problems, then it's too complicated. And perhaps just to end to the question of the gentleman over there with the international organizations, I believe a lot of international organizations would like to be more active, but they are driven by member states. So there's also a limited space of action for them.
Thank you. Arti?
Sure, thanks. So, I want to make a couple of final points, but first address your question on fostering innovation. I think it's a great question. At least where I sit in the US, a lot of the time, the conversation around fostering innovation is really driven by competitiveness and national security and not necessarily some of these other questions. I mean, we talk about that, but it's sort of secondary to the policy setting. And I see that maybe in some other OECD countries as well. And so I think having a conversation really around technology at an international level for like kind of societal good is quite an interesting one that I would also like to see happen. And, because facial recognition technology is one where I think there's a lot of hesitancy to develop it. I was at a financial services conference last week, though, and someone came to me with this idea that actually facial recognition technology could be a way to really help unbanked people in remote parts of the world very quickly apply for access to financial institutions, access to loans. That's a totally different way of thinking about the potential of facial recognition technology. And so it's a very complicated question, I guess, to say fostering innovation. And I think the only way to have that conversation is to have a conversation and not necessarily burden it with, we're starting off thinking about, are we going to cut off certain lines of research and cut off certain types of technology? And I'll use that as a segue into my last point, which is, I think, I started off saying technologists need a seat at the table because these are such complicated and fast evolving technologies. And I think one of the challenges is, how do we bridge communication across these different areas of expertise? And what I would say is that the answer to that is storytelling. It's storytelling. This is where facial recognition can be harmful. This is where facial recognition can be beneficial. And I think the onus is on all of us to try to figure out how to tell those stories, bring what we know to the table. And I don't think we do enough of it in policy discussions, but I think it can be very enfranchising to do that.
Thank you. That's some final words. How do you conclude?
In a way, my final word would be that it's good that it's getting all the attention that countries across the globe are seeing it as a core strategic topic. I would suggest that helps to prioritization, focus, and moving quickly. Every country is doing that, so I'm not too worried about the healthy competition. But I would like to be watchful. What is about data and ownership and privacy aspect of the user? In a race to be the first, we should not be. There are valid concerns that data privacy might take a backseat, or that the impact of a solution is not evaluated from all angles before it is rolled out. So my final word would be: we will be gradually moving towards making it an essential part of our policy making, but we should be concerned about our data ownership, privacy risk, and other risk of non-inclusivity. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for staying until the end. I think this is a fascinating panel that stressed how it was important to build bridges, but maybe we should start a bit smaller and think a specific use case. I think this was the main lesson for me. So thank you very much, and I'll give it to Elliot and Aisha for the panel.